Hello, welcome. Can anybody hear me? Is this working? Awesome, here we go, guys. So, welcome to this is the next event with the Authors Guild, and I am here to read you this introduction which you've never heard before. But before I do that, the most important thing, there is a book signing after the event, so I'd appreciate if you all don't come up and talk to the presenters here. You can talk to them in line for the book signing. So that's part one. Part two is the book signing. When you walk out the door, it'll be to your right, and there's places to buy books, and then you can get in line and have them signed. So I hope you all do that. Okay, now, getting started. Welcome to 2023 Annual Conference Book Fair in Seattle. I am your name. My name is Jeff Kleinman. I'm a member of the AWP Board of Directors. I am wearing a beautiful blue velvet blazer, and it has an I Love AWP button on it, which you guys can all get copies of downstairs in our AWP booth. I also have some in my bag if you need them. Okay, and I have dark hair, and that's enough about me. Okay, AWP is a small but mighty nonprofit organization that amplifies the voices of writers in academic programs and organizations that serve them, all while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. I'm a member of AWP's board of directors, I'd said that. But first and foremost, I'm a member of AWP membership. Oh crap, what'd I just do? Something bad just happened. Sorry, you know how it does this whole popping into welcome to, here we go again. Provides me with writing resources year-round, and most importantly, it allows me to support other writers, especially those who are just starting out. Membership dues help writers find meaningful careers and publication opportunities and make service like writer-to-writer membership program possible. If you aren't already, I invite you to become a member today. Together, we are AWP. It's really a great organization. So can we get a round of applause for Colleen? You guys have no idea how much work it is to put this on. It's a lot of work, and they really do a great job. Okay, we're delighted to bring you the event today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our conference sponsors and literary partner hosting the event, the Authors Guild. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking the Authors Guild. Yeah! Okay, now some housekeeping measures. Please silence your cell phones. Please remember there's no flash photography allowed during the presentation. You can take many pictures of me, however. Respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. Please give the authors about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed. So just repeating that again. Lastly, we ask you to be aware of your fellow attendees who may have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at, write this number down, 240-269-6635. That's 240-269-6635. Please be also aware that those with invisible disabilities are also here, and don't question someone's use of an accommodation. Thank you, and now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Cheryl Davis from the Authors Guild.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay. As he stated, I am Cheryl Davis. I am the General Counsel of the Authors Guild, and we're very happy to be here to present this reading and conversation with Stephen Graham Jones and Silvia Moreno-Garcia, who will be available on the screens to you. Since 1912, the Authors Guild has supported working writers by fighting for free speech, fair contracts, and a livable wage, because our literary culture depends on authors having the freedom to write. We are also proud to have Danielle Trussoni moderating today's talk. Danielle is a best-selling novelist whose work includes The Ancestor, Angelology, and the memoirs The Fortress and Falling Through the Earth. Her latest, The Puzzle Master, will be out this June. She has acted as jurist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction and is the creator of the Writerly podcast. You can read Danielle's Dark Matters column in the New York Times Book Review. Danielle also serves on the Authors Guild Council. Please welcome Stephen, Silvia, and Danielle.
So, welcome, everyone. Ooh. Welcome, everyone. I'll try that again, see if we get some feedback. It is such a pleasure for me to be here, and I have to say, it's one of those things that, if you could imagine up your sort of dream conversation, this would be it for me. So I'm very pleased that I'm here with Stephen and virtually Silvia. Sylvia, as you can see, she's here. I can't see her, so it's going to feel a little bit like talking to God, right? When please answer, and hopefully the tech works, and we'll all be able to have a conversation as if she were here, which, of course, we wish she was. And also, speaking of being here, I sent Stephen a message a couple weeks ago and asked him, about an event that's happening, and he informed me that Scream 6 is coming out today, so he may not be here at all. So I have to say that, I'm really, very happy that he's here with us, and it's all going to go forward as planned. Although, we could sneak out and go see it if you want. Okay, so the conversation is going to revolve around a couple of things that I'm interested in. And, it is a conversation. I don't really see it so much as me moderating as me just hanging out with Stephen and Silvia. And I'd love for you, Stephen, if you just want to jump in and ask, feel free to ask Silvia a question, me a question, same with Silvia. I feel like it would be great if all of you guys could simultaneously talk with us too, and it would just be one big conversation. But so it is. There's a stage, and we have to do it this way. I first became acquainted with both of these authors' work in the capacity as the horror reviewer for the New York Times Book Review.
Sorry.
See what I'm talking about? I'm talking to God, right? Here we go. And so I write it's supposed to be monthly. It tends to be a little bit, less than that, a column called Dark Matters for the New York Times Book Review, in which I'm sent galleys every month, and I get to choose the books that I want to review within the horror genre, essentially. And some of my favorite writers are those writers who walk the line between time and place, genre, dark and light, literary, and more playful, and basically mixing up all of these things in one sort of way of looking at literature. And Stephen and Silvia are both writers like that. I think that the first book of Silvia's that I read was Mexican Gothic, and I reviewed that. Was completely blown away, and with Stephen it was The Only Good Indians, which equally just blew my mind. And so since that point when I received those books, I sort of followed them, on social media, of course, but also their careers. Like when a new book comes out, I read it, and their work is always on my radar. So I'm going to start, because my introduction to them was through this window of genre, right, of horror. I'm going to ask them to talk to me a little bit about genre. Like, how did you become interested? I'm going to start with Stephen, Silvia. How did you become interested in the horror genre? Do you classify yourself as that? Because I know that you write in many genres, as does Silvia. What's your thoughts?
I do consider myself a horror writer. I mean, when people ask, what adjective do you want in front of your name, the only one I'm really interested in is bestselling, But,
there we go.
Yeah, but everything I write, I get bored about 2 or 3 pages in, and here comes a decapitation or an evisceration, and it turns into horror every time. But how I fell into genre, I think it was arbitrary. I was 11 years old, and I was already reading everything I could, but there wasn't that much to read out where I lived. One day I'm over at my uncle's house, and he says, "Hey man, I noticed you're always reading." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Come with me." And so we go down his hall to his linen closet, and he opens it up, and it's not sheets and blankets and pillows. It's his library, mass market paperbacks, front to back, side to side, bottom to top. And he said, "Take 3 of these, and when you're done with those, I'll give you 3 more." And I worked through his whole closet like that, and what he had was Conan the Barbarian, Mac Bolan, and Louis L'Amour. And so I went to Louis L'Amour and Conan a lot more than I went to Mac Bolan. Mac Bolan was not very interesting to me. But the other two, Conan especially, I think that's kind of where I whetted my appetite for horror.
Yeah, and you, Sylvia?
My parents were journalists, so growing up, we always had a ton of books around the house. And in terms of literature, we had everything. What we would call serious literature, or lit, uh, Latin American lit, and we also had a lot of foreign literature, American literature, and within that, commercial literature, genre literature, and horror. So the first writer that I read who was a horror writer, Edgar Allan Poe. And then I asked my mother if there was anything more like this. And she gave me a volume of H.P. Lovecraft stories. So that's how I started reading horror.
And would you define how do you feel about being? I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and not so much about how you got there, but how you feel about it. Do you appreciate being put into a category of genre, or would you rather be like, hey, I just write, and let's let the marketing people put it into a genre?
I switch all over the place, all over the map. I don't write in one single category. And so the problem with putting me in one specific niche is that people can get confused. So I wrote something that is very much a novel of manners, kind of romantic fantasy. It's called The Beautiful Ones. And I've had somebody who read that and then they read Mexican Gothic and they were very angry because they thought that it was a writer who wrote these soft, glossy fantasies, and then they read something else, and it was this kind of more violent Gothic novel. So I think I want people to be aware that I'm not necessarily a fantasist all the time. Sometimes I write stuff that is crime, that is noir. I have a completely realist novel coming out next year. So the problem is not that I feel bad about a specific label, such as horror writer. I just think it can be confusing to some people in the market if they don't understand my bibliography and the fact that I move around quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that I saw on Twitter a few years ago, actually before Mexican Gothic was coming out, I think you wrote a note and said, basically, nota bene, this is a horror novel, right? You were defining the genre for people. And I suppose that happens when you have people coming at you, right, and saying, what is this? You were supposed to write this way. But it also begs the question of, an existential question, I suppose, for writers. Like, are we limited? What are the limits of what we can write if we want to be published in a sort of mass market way? Stephen said, like, the label he wants is bestselling. So do we, do acrobatics to fit into a genre? Do we build, for example, Stephen King, who all of us here, or at least here on this stage, admire. He stays really in his lane. He doesn't go out. He's not going to end up writing, a memoir. Well, maybe he will, or like science fiction or something. Stephen, what do you think about that? Like, do you find yourself editing your imagination to fit into a genre?
No, I don't. But I'm not one of those people who just writes something and says, let the market figure out where it's positioned. And talking about labels, I have, ever since early in my career, back in 2000, and I think I learned this from Louise Erdrich, from watching her career, I never wanted to be called a Native American writer, because I think when you allow the market to put a handle on you like that, then that's a handle they can use to put you up on a shelf and forget about you, So ideally, yes, I just want to be a writer, but I do tend to write the bloody stuff, the dark stuff. That's just where my interests lie. And I don't know if I edit my imagination or where I'm going to go on the page, but I guess you kind of do have to be aware of what the market is going to tolerate from you to a certain extent. I think ever since Mongrels in 2016, I think all my books have been horror. Before that, I did a few horror books, some crime books, some weird literary books. I did a novel about a kid working the window of his father's drive-through urinal. I did a a book about a giant time traveling invisible centipede, and just a whole lot of stuff. But I'm so thankful that I got to play around and try on every hat I wanted to try on. I think that was vital to me figuring out who I was going to be and how I was going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, something that I've watched is that if you stay in that same genre for a while, it builds, right? And maybe that helps bring you more readers. But then, you know, I don't know. I think that it's a real question for people who make their living writing, right? Like how to do that. How do you feel about that, Sylvia? Do you feel like you've been pushed into a category, or is it your impulse, you know, like you did on Twitter, to just like be very adamantly definite about like this book is this genre and expect that?
I think that it's a question that is more charged for any writers of color, and certainly for other types of marginalized writers. We don't often get to choose whether we exist in a certain space or not. We are moved out of certain spaces or not allowed in certain spaces. So, for example, Latin American writers, there's a certain idea of what constitutes Latin American fiction and a proper Latin American writer. That is often tied to, for example, you have to write an immigrant story and it has to be a painful immigrant story, or perhaps you could do a magic realism story. And so that creates limitations for what you can create or not. And so you talk to a lot of Latin American writers that I know of, we do feel those pressures, and sometimes they are very explicit. I've had I had a cover recently where the cover art they put like jungle foliage and flowers, and it was not for one of my books that has a jungle or foliage. It was something that's set in Mexico City in the winter, Silver Nitrate, which is upcoming. But the publisher of that thought that they wanted to signal Mexicanness or Latin Americanness. And so they thought that could be signaled through jungles and tropical birds in a book that takes place in Mexico City in the winter. And Mexico City is very much like New York City. You wouldn't find a jungle in the middle of New York City. It's very urban, very modern, very fast, cars and all that kind of stuff. But there are certain ideas of how we represent that being Mexican visually. And that moves on to other deeper things, like in terms of the literature we write. So sometimes it's not a question of, do you want to sit on this shelf? It's just you are put on this shelf because that's the narrow space that you're allowed to. And and I have had conversations historically with my writing in which I was simply told that I would not be publishable if I picked a certain genre or tried to write in a certain genre. So nobody wants to read about, you know, Mexican science fiction.
And so I happen to have an early copy of Silver Nitrate, and the cover is great, by the way. So
Yes.
everybody, go on Amazon or wherever and pre-order. But Sylvia, so did you push back? How does one? I guess my question is, and what I'm trying to get at is, how do you have the freedom to let your imagination just and who you want to be as a writer push through those limitations? And so did you call a meeting with the marketing people? Like, how did you fix that problem? Because that is a really shocking decision that they made, considering that Mexico
Yes.
City is absolutely not in the jungle.
Yes, I do have to say this was not my Del Rey publisher, which is the red cover that you see. It was a licensed edition for another market.
Okay.
It's a bigger problem, I think, when you're licensing it for translation because a lot of other markets don't have often these sensibilities, and we've had some trouble with that. I am at a point in my career that I can demand a lot of things that I would not have been able to demand earlier on. So I can just pick up the phone and say, "You're going to fix this." Um, when I was at an earlier point in my career, I just had to make certain choices and I had to live with them about who I wanted to represent me or who I wanted to publish me. And I started in really in an indie space with a lot of short stories in a smaller space. And I built my career slowly up, kind of brick, 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 instead of making a big explosive debut. that was part of it. It was I found the places that were more willing to go with me, the editors that were more interested in my point of view. And maybe that was not I didn't walk in like the Kool-Aid man, like breaking the wall and just coming in like some other writers did with $1 million advance. But I was able to show that I could write stuff that would win awards and that also sold a certain number of copies and create, I think, a sense that it was marketable, even if I had been told early on in my career, we don't know how to sell this, which was one thing that I got quite early on, is like, we don't know how to sell this. And suddenly I was able to kind of show we are able to move X number of units. We are able to generate really good reviews and move on bit by bit. But it was difficult in the beginning. I think it's better now. I see a lot more writers of color and younger writers coming up the ladder. But certainly when Stephen and I were starting out 15 years ago, it was very much, you could count the people who were kind of people of color. And especially in certain genres like horror, you would kind of see each other across the room, and that was the one guy and that was the one girl. And you said hello, and that was sort of it.
Well, that's interesting because, Stephen, your impulse is to not be defined, in that way. So do you mind talking just a little bit about your journey, your path, right, into publishing? I mean, you started, the first books that you fell in love with were the ones in your uncle's closet, which is an amazing story. I love, imagining you as an 11-year-old with these books going off to read. But so how did you go from being that 11-year-old reading those books to someone who was able to publish?
Man, that's a long old story. I wasn't an English major in college. I never planned to go to college. I was just going to be a farmer. But suddenly I was there, and I was sitting in the back of a World Lit 2 room about this big. I was way at the back with a spiral and a pen, and some police officers come in, take their glasses off because it's dark, and they're looking all around. And I just go lower and lower in my seat, because in my whole life, every time cops come in the room, they're always there for me, And sure enough, they recognize me and they pull me out. And so I slouch out with them, not volunteering anything. And turns out I was not in trouble for once. One of my uncles had been burned over his whole body really, really badly and airlifted to the town I was in, the best burn unit in the region. And I was the only family member they could find. And so they brought me to his burn unit ICU for 3 days and 3 nights, waiting on him to live or die. All I had with me was that spiral and that notebook, and I got bored, eating all my meals from a vending machine, same clothes for 3 days. And I got bored and wrote a story, my first story. I'd never written a story before. I was 19 years old when this happened. And when I came back to my Composition 2 classroom on Monday, I had missed the previous Wednesday and Friday because I was at the hospital. I had not done the personal essay that was due. So I walked up to the desk and pulled those pages out of my notebook and gave them to the teacher, and I said, maybe this will get me some credit. And she shouldn't have read that at all because it was off assignment, handwritten, but she did read it, and she liked it enough to type it up and pass it on to the creative writing faculty, who then entered it into a departmental contest, which I won. So I got $50, and I had no idea you could get money for telling lies. That was the most amazing thing. And so I was off to the races. I kept doing that and kept doing that, and sure enough, I finally ended up in graduate school getting my doctorate. And at the last moment, one of my committee members had to dive off for a family emergency like 2 or 3 weeks before my defense. So I wouldn't have a quorum of people to defend against. So I went to my Gertrude Stein professor, Ralph Berry at Florida State University, and said, hey man, we've worked together on Gertrude Stein. Maybe you can just sit on my committee. You don't have to read this stupid book I wrote, but all you have to, and I don't care if you vote no, I just need a body in that seat. And he said, I'll do it. And so he shows up to my defense, and in his copy is marked up and folded, it's all beat up, he's been living with it. And I was like, dude, I didn't mean for you to read that thing. And he said, instead of asking me questions, he said, I want to publish this. And it turns out he was the publisher of FC2 at the time. And so that was amazing that's random that can work. And it was a good defense, I liked it, man.
That's good. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting the randomness that how we get along our path, to where we're going. Yeah, I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I do not come from a family of writers, and it was seen, the act of writing was seen as completely insane. You know, I got myself to college, and then they were like, and now, what are you doing with that education? And so I'm interested in how you integrate that. I don't know, like how do you integrate becoming a writer into your past? It sounds like you don't have many writers in your family, Stephen.
I don't know. Although two of my brothers are artists, I have a whole lot of brothers and sisters, and we all like to make stuff and tell lies.
Good, I'm getting some feedback here with my microphone, so I'm kind of playing with it. Okay, another question that I'm interested to ask both of you is, I'm something of a nomadic person. I'm American, but I have a dual citizenship in Italy, and I've lived at different places. I'm living in Mexico right now. And Silvia, I know that you were born in, I believe you were born in Mexico City. Is that correct?
I was born in Baja California, but I lived all around the country, and I lived
Oh,
a
okay.
larger chunk in Mexico City.
Okay, but now you're a Canadian citizen. Is
Yes.
that, and so there's this sort of feeling that I have in reading your book, Sylvia, of, you know, the books that I've read of yours are all set in Mexico. But I'm wondering, for me personally, when I write about something that's not close to me, that I'm far away physically, it helps me to imagine and to create something. And I'm wondering if your decision to leave Mexico and live in Canada has an artistic component. Does it help you write? Do you feel exile? Do you feel nostalgia? How does that factor into your work?
Yeah, the first big contest that I won was for a Canadian magazine called Exile Magazine, and it's not about exiled writers, but I was at the library and I saw it, and it caught my attention for that reason, because the title Exile, and I thought, oh, I'm an exile writer, and then I read it, and at the very back of that issue, it said that they were going to have a contest, their first writers contest, short fiction contest, and so I sent the story. It was called Scales as Pale as Moonlight, and I won. I won $3,000. It was my first big prize. I had been selling short stories for $10 and $20 and $30 a pop for fantasy and science fiction fanzines and semi-prozines, like they're called. But this was my first big prize, and it was that. It was the exile really kind of attracted me. They say that you can't really appreciate your country, where the place where you come from, until you have a little bit of distance, and I think that's true. I think a lot of the things that I didn't quite like and that annoyed me about Mexico are the things that I now remember fondly about it. And I'm sure if I left Canada, it would be kind of the same kind of story. It does help to kind of get a little bit of a perspective. It's like when you're in a macro shot in film and then you move out and you zoom out, sometimes you can get a lot of details of the room like that way, as opposed to being focused in a very small corner of it. So it's part of it. I've talked about that I want to write a Vancouver book, but I feel that I haven't lived here long enough. But now that I'm nearing, I'm going to get close to 2 decades at some point, and I think at that point I will have matured enough to write my Vancouver book. I have an idea for it, but it's just that I like to write things that I feel that I know very well, very intimately, and I think I know Mexico very intimately. Other places, I have a certain fear of going into space that I don't know very well, so I don't know if I would be able to write a New York City story. Although my next novel, The Seventh Mail of Salome, is set in LA, in Los Angeles, but it's a little bit different, LA. So yeah, there's certain places that I just feel that I need to know them better. We need to spend more time together. And I don't think that even like 6 months would be enough for something like that, for a project like that for me.
Well, that actually brings me to this idea of research a little bit, right? And now that you say that you have, I don't know if this novel that's set in LA is finished or if you're currently writing, but how did you do research for that novel then? If it's, did you go live there? Do you go back to Mexico occasionally to, sort of take a look around, or is everything sort of in your imagination, in your head from lived experience?
The LA book came about because it's set in Hollywood in the 1950s, and it's a time period and a place that I think I know intimately because I've always had a love affair with film, and especially with old films. I've been reading biographies and about movie stars for ages and ages, and a lot of what I watch is actually really old. I watch the Criterion Channel. I tend to not watch anything current, so I tend to live in the past in a way, in a state of time travel where a lot of my existence is kind of like in 1955, despite being in the present. So I felt that because of that, I was able to tackle it because I knew the 1950s of film, and it's a curious book because it involves reality and unreality in a way. But I thought because of that, because I have spent almost my entire life almost living in the past, in the Hollywood past, that I would be able to write about it.
I love that you said it involves reality and unreality because that's an element of both you and Stephen's work that I really love. So I'm going to throw this question to Stephen, I guess. How do you, when you're composing a work, when you're writing a work, and you veer off into things that feel supernatural, for example, or the unreal, how do you integrate that into the book? Is that something that you plan? Is it something that you impulsively do? And do you find that there's a craft, I'm just sort of for the writers out here, like a craft element that helps to make that more believable or sustainable or aesthetically whole within the piece that you're working on?
It is always an impulsive jump for me. I never have anything planned. So like when a bioluminescent telepathic kangaroo shows up, I'm like, wow, what's gonna happen here, But I think the trick is, if there is a trick at all, or I take the trick from like Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, where they ask, what if superheroes were real? And if they were real, then there's no superhero comics at the newsstand. There's pirate comics instead. And I heard some science fiction writer say a long time ago, I'm gonna get the number wrong, but I think it was a guy, he was talking about how like the one fantasy element you put into the pond of reality will have ripples, and it's a lot more real if you can explain the fifth ripple out than the first ripple out. And so that's what I try to do. I try to imagine if werewolves were real, then this, and this, and it's that fifth this that actually sells the reality of the supernatural in the book, for me anyways.
Yeah, so you're talking about mongrels, for example,
Yeah.
like when, yeah. So do you mind, this is for me because I haven't reviewed, that's a book I haven't reviewed, and that's a book that I also really like. What was the origin of that book for you?
I just like to look at pretty werewolves, mostly. But I've been,
Don't we all?
Yeah. In 1999, I wrote, I think it was the third novel I ever wrote. I wrote a werewolf novel called, I forget what it was called, Bloodlines. It was called Bloodlines. And it didn't work, so I put it on the shelf. And in 2013, I decided, I had like 25 books or something under my belt, and I thought, maybe I've got enough craft in me now, I can write the werewolf novel I want to write. So I sat down, cooked for about 120 pages, and the novel kind of stalled, and my novels don't stall, and I was like, what's going on? So I went back to look at what I'd done, and I forgot to have like an antagonist or a plot or anything.
Oops.
I know, I was just like looking at pretty werewolves. And so I scrapped that, I've never finished that, and I went and wrote a comic book instead, which was really fun. And then at the last moment, I remember a friend called me up on like a Tuesday, and he said, hey man, you said you'd write a werewolf story for me, and it's due tomorrow. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm right on top of that, And and so I went and I had a jug of chocolate-covered sunflower seeds, and I just slammed those all at once so I'd get all jittery, and I wrote a story for him real fast, because I can always write a werewolf story, and sent it to him, and that was at the very end of November. And then I spent all of December, I got a little grant from my school to teach a werewolf course. And so I got to spend like $1,500 on werewolf books, movies, action figures, everything I could buy werewolfy. And for 1 month, I gave myself 30 days to cram it all in my head, and I did. But then my head got too full. And January 1st loomed, and my semester started on January 15th, I believe it was, that semester. And so I had to get my head unpacked, and so I started writing werewolf stories. And I looked up about 10 days in, and I was like, man, this is like 300 pages of junk. And then I realized, if I made these characters have the same name, this could be a novel. And so in 14 days, I wrote Mongrels, and that first story I'd written in November ended up being the opening chapter. So when I talk about I write impulsively or with no plan, Mongrels is a good example of that. But also, I think that's how you get novels that are properly weird.
Yeah.
Like The Only Good Indians, I was not trying to write a novel, I was trying to write a novella. And I got to the end of the first part, and I capped it off, and then another line occurred to me. So I called my agent up and I said, hey, should I keep this a novella or make it a novel? And she answered right back. She said, make it a novel. They're easier to sell. So I made it a novel, So the best books, in my experience, they rely on luck and they're always accidents. Anything I plan falls to pieces. But the things I stumble into and feel my way through, they tend to get lucky.
Yeah, so I love that phrase. I think Picasso said that the muse finds him when he's at work, right? Mm-hmm. And so, that process of discovery and accident and happenstance that you're describing, I think is something that we all, as artists, really strive to find. And so I'm curious about what your writing process is like. Do you, some people sit from 8 until noon every day, and some people write. And the reason I ask you this specifically is because I have received an email from Stephen, and at the bottom of it, it says, my working hours may not be your working hours. That was very intriguing to me, because I'm like, okay, well, what are his working hours, and how do you know what my working hours are? So I'm curious, what are your working hours, and what's your process, like your daily process?
My process for a novel is I just like to stand around in my head, and I feel like, y'all remember in one of those Douglas Adams books that he always blips into this planet, and there's these massive, unnamed creatures that run past. I feel like I'm standing in my head, and there's all these big, monstrous creatures running every which way around me, and every once in a while, one of them gets close enough that if I time my steps just right, I can jump out and grab onto its tail and hold on for 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And at the end of it, I'm all torn up and bleeding and everything, but I've got a novel. Like, if I spend longer than 10 weeks on a novel, I generally throw it away because it's not doing nothing. Don't Fear the Reaper, my most recent novel, it was a 10-week novel. And that was while I was doing a lot of teaching, a lot of script work and stuff. I'm always racing for that light at the end of the tunnel, but I don't ever have a schedule. I'm really afraid of writing becoming a chore. I don't want to groan and go, I got to go to the desk to write. Writing is playtime. Writing is research. Recess. I get to play with dragons, and what could be more fun than that? I think it should always be fun. I see writers in interviews and social media casting about, doing a romantic pose, writing is so hard. And yeah, everything is hard, but writing is fun. I wouldn't do it if it wasn't a blast. If it wasn't fun to play in made up spaces that I can give real emotional weight to. That it just means so much to me. It's how I make sense of the world. And therefore, the way I like to write is kind of the way. Do y'all remember back when Goblet of Fire was the 4th Harry Potter book came out? By that time, that series had a lot of momentum, and you'd walk around town and you'd see people on the sidewalk reading it. They're standing at the ATM reading it. They're in traffic reading it in their lap. That's how I write when I'm writing a novel. Every little nook and cranny of the day, I stuff it with sentences, with paragraphs, with lines my characters can say, and somehow it all comes together sometimes.
And so when you turn it into your editor, for example, what is the process at that point? Or do I'm assuming it goes first to your agent and then to your editor.
Yeah, I give it to my agent, and I'm like, all right, I'm done. This is the final version. And she informs me this is the first draft, But they, sometimes they need a lot of overhauling because they're broken in just a variety of interesting ways. And sometimes they just need a spell check, But let's see, Only Good Indians is an example. My editor at Saga, Joe Monti, the first part of that book, the first long section, The House That Ran Red, it's this character, Louis and Peta, just living in their house, in their rental home. That was originally written in what you think is second person, and at the end, the rug kind of gets pulled out from under your feet and it's revealed to be dramatic monologue, which I thought was a wonderful trick. And Joe said, I appreciate the literary like pyrotechnics and the degree of difficulty here, but come on, let's be serious. Why don't you just tell a good story, you know? And so I had to go back and suck all that fun stuff out and just tell it straight. And he was right. That was the proper delivery method. But I oftentimes get too close. My impulse is to have too much fun in all the avenues, like all the different branches, you know, like delivery, content, all of it. And sometimes you can't do all of it successfully.
Yeah. So I want to pass this over to Silvia, but I want to ask you one more thing. So how many books have you worked on with Joe?
Let's see, we did The Only Good Indians, we did My Heart is a Chainsaw, we did Babysitter Lives, we did Don't Fear the Reaper. We're currently doing, I almost said the title, the third Indian Lake book.
Oh, is that a secret?
Yeah, it's a secret.
And it's on
Right?
tape too. Like,
Yeah.
like that would have been over.
And also, we're in notes for I Was a Teenage Slasher too.
Okay, so quite a few.
Yeah, quite a
And
few.
that process, I think, it probably has become part of your process, right? To like be
Yeah.
imagining that this
Yeah.
guy is going to be editing it.
I do. Like, I feel like I probably kind of tailor my novels to fit what I anticipate his objections are going to be, in
Yeah.
a sense, you know, which is good because he has good objections. So if I
Right.
can build those in, then it'll be a better novel, I think. I'm trying to think what was the biggest change. Joe usually changes my titles, you know, like
Nice.
Good Indians was not Good Indians was not Good Indians. My Heart is a Chainsaw wasn't My Heart is a Chainsaw. He always pushes me. Like sometimes I settle, and I kind of have like a nostalgic fascination with a title or something, and he'll tell me, we want this to jump off the shelf. We want it to captivate the reader from a distance and all that. And he's right. He has a much better sense of how publishing works and how the market works than I do. Like, I feel like I have an okay hand on narrative, and I can dramatize stuff all right. I can pack emotion and fun into a piece, but there's all kinds of aspects of the process that I don't have the best handle on, and I'm lucky to work with people who are professionals and have a lot of experience.
Yeah, what a gift, right? To have someone that knows your work that well that can be like, I know what you're trying to do here,
Yeah.
and we're just going to do this, and it's going to actually do it.
Yeah, but like with My Heart is a Chainsaw, I turned it into him, and he wrote back and he said, oh, it's a novel about gentrification. And so I tabbed over to my dictionary and I was like, gentrification. And and I was like, yeah, I guess so, whatever, if it makes him happy, you know?
Oh, I love it. So Sylvia, I wanted to come back to you and go back to the question about process. You know, what is your process, you know, as an artist, you know, when you're writing? Is it every day? Do you get, you know, like Stephen, you know, you're inspired by a project and you just work on that until it's done and then you take a break? Or do you have a set sort of ritual for writing?
No, I don't think rituals are useful. You have to be nimble and be able to work under a number of conditions. People who are like, I need a special candle and I only write on Tuesdays when it rains, I don't think they can produce very much. So I think you have to train yourself to be nimble. I'm used to writing at nights because of working a day job for so many years. And I've had a day job all my career. Only last year I quit my day job and I've now been kind of freelancing as a writer for full time, and it's a different kind of existence. I work every day, but I don't write every day, which people kind of find kind of weird. They think that writers are chained to their desks, but there's a lot of other stuff that happens. For example, this presentation, other kinds of meetings, and a lot of research and things that don't necessarily occur in front of your computer. So I try to work every day, and sometimes that does involve a certain amount of writing. I try not to judge it by the minutes spent, but I tend to want to reach a certain word count. If I'm working on something, I feel happy if, you know, between 500 and 1,000 in a day is a good space, and that adds up to a novel. But it's not a, yeah, I think it's like what we were talking about before. There's a romantic notion of the writer, and then there's the reality of the working writer. And if you've read enough biographies about working writers, about especially the pulpsters, but even some of who we consider to be the frilly literary writers, you'll know that Flaubert, for example, who is one of my beloved writers, his problem was that he didn't write fast enough, so he wrote very little. And he would write to other writers that he knew, and he would be like, I admire you so much. You come up with with a book every year or every 2 years, and I would be like, yes, Flaubert, but that person was not going around looking at flowers and just contemplating them like you are. And so he was a magnificent writer, but he was not super productive. So there's different kinds of writers, and definitely I'm not the Flaubert type that is going to take 10, 20 years to write my epic poem.
What I admire about both of you, as a working writer myself, is your productivity. I'm impressed. Um, how many books, Stephen, didn't you say somewhere between 25 and 30 books that you've written? And Sylvia, I'm not sure the exact number, but, since I've been paying attention, it's been one a year. And, so is this, I think, maybe by not jinxing it, right? By not setting a sort of schedule, maybe you're able to be more productive. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I always, I think the writers who make it are the writers who, they're like, for some reason, Blackie Lawless of Wasp is my avatar for this. Do y'all know Blackie Lawless? Wasp? All right. He's like Wasp was, I don't know, they probably peaked around 86, I guess, a hair metal band. Maybe not that musically competent, but they were fun, Blackie Lawless, he was kind of like I don't know, an Alice Cooper, mix between Alice Cooper and Vince Neil. But something about his persona tells me that even if he never got ushered to a microphone and the hot lights, he would still be in his bedroom putting on the spandex and putting the white rain in his hair and dancing in front of his mirror, And I think that's how you got to be as a writer. Like if the market turns its back on me and I lose my publisher, my agent, everybody, then I'm still going to write, because writing is what I do. It's who I am. It's how I make sense of the world. And I say the writers who make it are the ones like Blackie Lawless, but also I think Rocky from the movie is very important in that regard as well. What Rocky does is he gets up every time he's knocked down, and he has, like Drago says, he's a thing of iron. I've seen so many writers I've been doing this for 20 plus years, so many extremely talented writers come and go. They do a book that blows me away, and then they just kind of shrug and go do something else. And it's not that they're not real writers, it's that I suspect it's that their artistic, I don't know, impulses, it's more about being creative than it's doing stuff on the page. But there are people who can only do stuff on the page, like myself. I'm not going to be a sculptor, I'm not going to play piano, any of that. But I can sometimes get words ordered on the page in such a way that they pack a feeling or a thought I've got down such that the reader can unpack it and feel some version of that same thing, whether it's scary, funny, sentimental, whatever. As long as I can engage in that magic of transmission like that, across decades, across light years, whatever, then I consider myself hugely fortunate. And like Sylvia was saying, it is really dangerous to ritualize your writing. If you need that candle by your desk to write, then really what you're doing is you're giving yourself an excuse not to write, So it seems like getting to the keyboard is a big part of it is just taking away potential excuses. I always like Neil Gaiman's advice that he'll say if he has a thing due, then he'll block off 2 hours to get it written or to get a piece of it written. And he says during those 2 hours, he has to sit there at the keyboard or the notebook, whatever it is. And it's not that he has to write, but he can't do anything else. He can't play on email or social media or anything like that. He can only write. That's the only thing he can do for 2 hours. And you do that for 45 minutes, and you're going to get bored and start writing, I think.
Pour yourself into productivity. I think that's a brilliant way to do it. Of course, it's just like you in the hospital, right? Like you were there and you had your notebook and nothing else to do. And it's amazing what comes out. Sylvia, you mentioned earlier that your parents were journalists. Did seeing people writing around you and writing on a deadline and the different kinds of things that they did as writers, did that intrigue you, inspire you, or were you trying to find a different way to write when you became a novelist?
They were radio journalists, so it was a little bit different, but it did give me two things. And one was that I was able to understand the lifestyle without the romantic blinders that I think a lot of people have. Being a journalist is may seem romantic from afar, but it's a very unstable job gig. You often don't have a lot of money. So in a way, it's very similar to a fiction writer's career, any kind of other artistic pursuits. So it just made me aware of what it takes to survive in that kind of profession, and that it's not like in Sex and the City when you saw that Carrie had this really big apartment and she had really nice shoes. It's pretty bleak at times.
Really, it's not. Oh no.
It's not, surprisingly, yes. But the other thing that was there was just a cultural cachet. It is fortunately the kind of profession where you can be, like my father used to say, we are money poor but culture rich. And that was true because we had a lot of music and a lot of books at home. There was a lot of access to literature because they could get books really easily as journalists, advance review copies, all that kind of stuff, and CDs and music. And I remember even my middle class and upper middle class classmates at school and who were very well off, they wouldn't have any books in the house. You would go into their house and there would be this beautiful living room and this big TV, and they had cable, which at the time was insane in the late 1980s or the early 1990s, prohibitive. They'd have a Nintendo, but they wouldn't have any books. Almost nobody had books. Almost nobody was reading, and um, and so it was kind of having access to the special universe. And it is very important to have that access to literature, to culture that I had. And so it did give me a lot of I don't have an MFA. I didn't study literature or anything like that. um, I have a master's degree in science and technology studies and a bachelor's degree in communications. So I went down a different path. But I learned, basically, I had a full literary education, as good as any MFA, by the time I was 18 or 19, because of all those books, right? And not everybody has access to that. And that's one of the things that I had, that I was very lucky in that sense. And I think at one point I wanted to be a screenwriter, not a book writer, but I fell in love with books eventually. And I still love film, but I kind of drifted from that first idea of writing for film, and it became writing for books.
It's interesting that you say that. And Stephen, earlier you said that you are also writing some scripts. I don't know if I misheard. Is that true? Because the structure of writing scripts is really interesting to me as a writer. I've written a few pilots and things like that myself, and what it did to my writing as a novelist is it kind of restructured in my brain how a story works. And I don't know if that happened to you, Stephen or Silvia. I don't know who would want to jump in for that, but or if you see writing novels as a kind of different category entirely, without those structures of like Act 1, Act 2, or the sort of rigid structures that happen in script writing. Do you want to do that one, Stephen?
Sure. I don't think writing scripts, features, or television has changed what I do on the fiction page, because you're right, it does feel like a totally different category. I do sometimes feel comic books kind of impinging or bleeding across into fiction a little bit for me. It takes me longer to write comic scripts than it takes to write fiction, even though there's so many less words on the page. And the reason for that is, with a comic script, you have 22 pages, so you have to figure out you have to figure out how it's going to work and how it's going to peak, and you have to stage the page turns. And it's a wildly different way of thinking than fiction writing, where you have sentences, paragraphs, parts, sections, chapters, all that. It's just wildly different and really challenging and fun, but it's made me have to either plan or, after the fact, pretend like I planned,
Lots of revisions.
Yeah.
Do you have like a board? You know how you see in movies where people have the boards and they're like structuring everything?
No, I wish I was that organized, but no. I just realized on the plane here last night that I had a script due on Wednesday, a comic script.
Oh,
so
no.
I had to do 20 pages of that on the plane, and I got to do 20 pages on the way back. Not 20. I got to finish it by the time I get back. And I mean, ideally with film and television, also you have the move from Act 1 to Act 2 figured. You have all that stuff figured out ahead of time. But the way I've generally done features is I write it, and then if it's not working, then I go back and use the act structure to diagnose what isn't working. I find that more productive, actually.
To go back after the fact and kind of lay a template over it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these tricks that writers do, right? Like for me, I have to write the first draft by hand. I have a pen and a certain kind of, maybe this is my candle, I like a certain kind of notebook, and I write in it, and I can produce a lot more if I feel free enough to do that. Silvia, have you written scripts, or is that something that you aspire to do?
I mean, I did when I was young, but it's something that I'm probably going to go back to this year or next year, trying to write a movie script. Yeah.
Oh, fun. Cool. Good luck.
The weird thing, the big difference I found between book industry and Hollywood is that in the book industry, the people giving me notes have a lot of experience in bookland. In Hollywood, that doesn't seem to be the case.
It's somebody's assistant's assistant, right?
Yeah.
Right. I know. It's my experience. I'm not going to say all of this too much on the record, but that there's people seem a bit more sincere in the New York book world, and most of them have really made a life commitment to it.
I think the trick is with film and television productions, there's so much more money at stake that they have to interrogate every little shade of a step.
Right. Yeah, and they can throw the deal out the window at any point too, right? Like I remember there was one of my books had sold, and it was just a handshake basically, like, yeah, we want it, this is the amount, and then no contracts happened for months and months, like maybe even a year later, right? And I was writing the book. In LA, they can say that, and then 2 weeks later, it's like, oh, no, we found someone else, or we're not interested. Yeah. So, there was something I wanted to ask you, Stephen. Like, I found a quote, I have written it down, that I really liked of yours, and I just wanted to ask you about it. The quote is, "Life's so much easier when you're not always maintaining two worlds. The one formed of lies, which feels real, and the one that you live in, which often feels like lies. So easy to get them confused." And I just wanted you to break that down, if you don't mind, and talk to me about this. Are you talking about fiction and reality here, or what are you talking about when you say that?
I am talking about fiction and reality, and I think that was in response to somebody asking me, why do I write so quickly? Like, why do I hurtle through a novel? And it's because for me to engage a novel enough that I can make it real on the page, I have to invest emotionally and intellectually to such a degree that it erases a line between the fake and the not fake. And that's a terrible place to try to live, because I go to the store to get some Sixlets or a Milky Way or something, and I look up, I hear somebody coming around the corner, and I look up, and I 100% expect it to be a side character from my novel, and it takes me a few seconds to realize, oh, I'm not in that space anymore. I'm here in this world, not that world. And it's just really hard to live like that, for me anyways. Maybe some people can pull it off. I have a hard time doing it. And so because I do invest so fully like that, I try to go really, really quickly through that space such that I can plant my feet back in the real world and deal with real people for a while.
Do you have to do that in between? Can you time it so, like, okay, I have these months off from teaching. Do you still teach, actually?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
I wasn't meaning to teach this year, but I ended up in a teaching gig up in Missoula because I wanted to be in Missoula. But what I've found is, when I take a year off, I just watch Rockford Files and listen to Bob Seger, But if I am somehow trying to juggle classes and Hollywood work and stuff, then I get a novel idea, and I'm like, well, I better write this novel too on top of everything else. And so I end up sleeping 4 hours a night for 6 weeks, and it burns you up, but who cares if you get something done?
Right, if you have that at the end. And I have a quote from Silvia that I pulled too that I'm going to ask her about. So, yeah, this was taken from an interview you did, Silvia, and I really found it interesting. She said, "I like to ground my work in historical fact because the truth can be surreal. You can't quite believe the things that you find in footnotes." And I found that fascinating. Is there, I think you were talking about this in relationship to the Daughter of Doctor Moreau, but are there other instances where sort of historical footnotes became really prominent for you, or do you have an example of a kind of surreal footnote that you're talking about in this quote?
Yeah, Silver Nitrate, my next novel, started because of a footnote in a book I was reading about occultists in 19th century France during the fin de siècle, and they were doing rituals and whatever. And there was a footnote that said that one of the occultists there he was a German occultist, and he went to Mexico and and knew President Madero there. And I knew through previous research that I had done that Madero had been a spiritualist, so he believed in ghosts and seances and that kind of stuff. So it made sense that he would be kind of chatting with an occultist. But I thought a German occultist in Mexico, and so then I did some research on this guy, and his name is Hum Keller, and I found out that he did live in Mexico, and I found one of his manuals of occultism, and it was very racist. It was super, super racist kind of material. And it had to do with scents and fragrances and also occultism at the same time. And that got me down a rabbit hole of occultism. And so Silver Nitrate is about two people who find out about this occultist who was in Mexico in the 1950s and made this film. And the film has some kind of magical power. But it all started with that thing. It was just this really weird thing to suddenly be reading and then find that, oh, this German guy ended up in Mexico. And then I kept finding people who ended up in Mexico and had ties to occultism. So just like in other places, and I started building this big body of work but it just started with that one quote where it had this name of this guy, and it said in the bottom, oh, and by the way, in such and such year, he moved to Mexico, and he was a friend of the president of Mexico.
Yeah, I can see how that would feel surreal, right? to find
Well,
information like that.
it's not the only example. There's
Yeah.
been a lot.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I actually live in Mexico now, and there are many instances where I'm confronted with the sorts of things that you write about. That it is amazing, quite amazing. And so, but I'm also interested in how that translates, that initial shock of a sort of dissonance between how you see reality and this other thing, this footnote that is very disrupting, translates itself into the kind of magic on the page. And, both of you, as I've said before, explore, surrealism in some, I suppose, I wouldn't call it surrealism because sometimes it feels like reality, right? So, I don't know, Stephen, do you have any thoughts about, I think we covered this, but the process of moving reality into the supernatural in your work?
Well, first, in answer to the footnote question, what is Noel Coward? He says about footnotes that they're like going downstairs to answer the door during sex, which I always appreciate that. But also, I've done a novel with 485 footnotes, so I'm not immune to the allure of footnotes. I love a good footnote,
Major coitus interruptus, right?
Yeah. But yeah, reality and the supernatural. Let me think. What I like about the supernatural impinging or working its way into our world is that you crack that door open and a tentacle slithers through and it starts to wrap around your ankle and you're like, it's going to pull me into the darkness. That's terrible. But when you crack that door open for the shadowy stuff to come through, look up along that doorway because there may be something magical and amazing coming through too. If you allow the bad supernatural, you're also allowing the good supernatural. And I think, what's that guy's name? He's a philosopher, Gregory Bateson, I think it is. He talks about the re-enchantment of our world, and I think that art can do that, and supernatural may have a really good hook into that. It may be like a wedge that opens that door for us a little bit, and it can let wondrous stuff through, but it can also let dark stuff through, and I like to play in that doorway. That's my favorite place to play.
I love that idea of re-enchanting our world.
Mm-hmm.
That something has been lost. We're doing it again.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what horror does specifically,
right.
Because, we came up on the savannah for 6 million years with everything, like we were the chicken nuggets of the savannah. We didn't have sharp claws, big teeth, we couldn't jump real high. We were just like food bags for everything that came from the sky or lurked in the grass. And that hardwired fear into us. And now in today's modern world, we shine a light into all the dark corners. We sterilize all the surfaces, and our world is it's a lot safer than it was on the savannah. But the problem is we're still wired for that fear, and horror can give that fear back to us. And when we're afraid, I think that's when we're the most human.
Yeah, and it also can make things feel magical in a place that is maybe sanitized out of the the magic has been eradicated and sanitized and disinfected. Well, I have to say that both you and Silvia, your work is magical, and I'm very thankful to both of you for all you've written. It's been a great pleasure for me to be able to read it and review it. And we only have about 5 minutes left, so I don't know. Silvia's talked a little bit about this. Stephen, you less so, about what's next. I'd love to hear, if you have a project you're working on or anything you'd like to let people know about.
Well, my next project is to get hold of Silvia's Silver Nitrate, to read that.
It's hot property.
Yeah, but I have the third Chainsaw book is coming out before too long, and somebody told me I have somebody like at my publisher, not just a random person on the street. They told me. They said I had 3 novels coming out next year, which seems kind of extreme.
Wow.
So I don't know.
From the same publisher or from different ones?
The same publisher, yeah. I'm only with one publisher these days. In the early part of my career, I was with a different publisher for every book, because like you were saying, publishers want the same book with the variables changed, and I never wanted to do that. I always wanted to do something wildly different each time out. But so I think I have 3 slashers coming out, and I think I've sold 2 or 3 more books that are in the pipeline somewhere. I can't really announce the next Chainsaw book yet, but I keep almost saying it too, which is terrible.
Maybe we're like scheming. Sadie and I have a plan. We're like, let's just get him to talk about the next book.
Yeah, for sure. But lots of books in the pipeline. Earlier you mentioned, you're saying you asked me how many books I'd written, and I was like, oh man, that's a crazy question, because I think I've probably written, 45, 48 books, but published, I bet I've published 30 or 32, but I bet most writers are like this. We've written, a lot of novels I write, I finish it, and I'm like, well, it was fun, but it's never going to do nothing. So I just don't throw it away, but I stuff it into a hole and don't worry about it anymore. I'm never worried about running out of juice, running out of words. There's always going to be more words. So I think you can burn, if you write something and it doesn't live up to what you thought it was going to be, feel free to throw it away. And you don't have to go back and mine it. Everything you write is a learning experience, and you're going to be better next time out, I think.
And Silvia, do you, we know that Silver Nitrate's coming out in July, I believe, and are you working on is the LA book something you're working on, or is that done?
Yeah, it's been sent to my editor, so I'm waiting for notes. So that's the Seventh Veil of Salome, and that's the Hollywood book, which is my attempt to write what would be Sword and Sandals movie, like those Bible epics that they made in the 1950s, Spartacus and Solomon, those kinds of books. So it's about that kind of movie that's being shot. And it's what I call my realist/unrealist book. Because nothing fantastical happens, But I think
Hollywood is surreal
is,
enough, right?
it's a sense of unreality.
Okay.
What about you, Danielle?
Oh, well, I have a book coming out in June. Oh my God. What month is it now? Where are we?
March.
Okay, I have a novel coming out in June, and I'm frantically working on the next one in that. It's a series. So, Well, thank you both. This has been really a pleasure for me, and I hope everybody here enjoyed it and run out and buy their books. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.